Something is in the water beneath Antarctica, and the men who saw it did not reach for a word like beast or monster or creature. They reached for the most personal word they knew. They called it human. That single choice of name is the reason this story never dies. That is the reason it keeps climbing back to the surface every few years. Carried in the mouths of new crews on new ships, described the same way, in the same cold detail, by men who had never heard the word before the night they stood at the rail and saw something pale and enormous moving beneath them in the black water. You need to understand where these men were standing before any of this makes sense. The Southern Ocean is not a place most people will ever see. It wraps around the entire bottom of the planet in one unbroken belt. No continent sits in its path to slow it down. No landmass interrupts the wind. The storms that build in that water do not pass in a single afternoon. They dig in for days at a time, stacking wave after wave until the sea becomes something that looks less like water and more like a moving mountain range. Sailors who have spent time down there describe waves taller than apartment buildings rolling in from 1,000 miles of nothing. Not a single tree in sight, not a single light on the horizon, just the dark and the cold and the sound of wind that has been building for so long it has forgotten how to stop. The water itself sits just above freezing. It is dense and heavy in a way that the ocean most people swim in is not. It presses down into depths that almost no instrument has ever properly mapped. Scientists confirmed as recently as October 2025 that the Southern Ocean remains, in their own words, profoundly undersampled. A research expedition that same year sent vessels into those waters and pulled up 30 previously unknown deep-sea species in a single expedition. 30 creatures that had never been named, never been photographed under proper lights, never been held in a gloved hand. One of them was a carnivorous sponge shaped like a ball, covered in tiny hooks that trap and kill prey. Something that sounds like it came from a nightmare was sitting down there all along, completely unknown to science until 2025. The expedition team described their findings as mind-blowing, and that was just what they found in 1 month of looking. This matters. This matters enormously. Because when people hear about something unknown in the Southern Ocean, the first reaction is usually to say, that is impossible. The ocean is mapped. We would know. And the honest answer is that we would not know. We barely look. The depth is real. The blank spaces are real. And the things living in them keep surprising the scientists who occasionally manage to get close enough to see. So now place a man on a ship in that water. Not a tourist, not someone on a weekend trip. A professional, a researcher on a long deployment, maybe a fisheries observer, maybe part of a Japanese whale survey team, the kind of operation that spent months at a time in the far south, logging data in conditions that break most people in a week. These were men who had spent entire seasons at sea. Men who measured their experience not in trips but in winters. Men who knew this ocean, the way a mechanic knows an engine, not by reading about it, but by spending years inside of it. A man like that, standing watch in the gray half-light of the polar night, can look at a disturbance on the surface from half a mile away in poor visibility and tell you whether it is a whale blow or just spray torn off the top of a swell by the wind. He does not have to think about it. He just knows. His entire professional value depends on not seeing things wrong, on not confusing one thing for another, on reporting exactly what is there. And the earliest accounts of the Ningen came from men exactly like that. The original stories surfaced through Japanese research vessels operating in Antarctic waters in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Crew members from whale survey programs who had spent long contracts in the far south began describing something they had seen at night, something they could not classify, something that did not fit in any category their experience had given them. The accounts did not come with photographs, they came with descriptions. And the descriptions were the problem, because the descriptions were wrong in a way that none of these men could talk themselves out of. It always begins the same way. The timing is important, always the same. It is the gray hour before dawn in the polar dark, that strange, sourceless light that drains the color from everything and turns the sky and sea and deck the same shade of pale bone. A crewman is at the rail or up on watch. He notices something. A pale patch, low in the water, just off the side of the vessel, lighter than the sea around it, half submerged, drifting, or so it seems at first. And his first thought is always the most obvious thought possible out there. Ice. Of course it is ice. These waters are full of it. Pale, half-submerged, drifting. He has seen 10,000 pieces of it in his career. He barely registers it. He looks away, checks an instrument, writes a number in the log, wipes the spray off his face. Then he looks back, and the patch has moved, not drifted, not bobbed slowly on a swell the way ice bobs, moved with direction, traveled across his field of view in a way that drifting ice simply does not do. And worse than that, it is moving against the current, slow, steady, holding a line, pushing against the direction the water is flowing. Ice does not do that. Ice surrenders to the sea. Ice goes where the water and the wind take it. Ice does not choose a direction and maintain it. But whatever this was, it held its course. It moved like something that had decided where it was going. That is the detail that breaks the rational explanation. A man can argue himself out of a shape in the dark. The brain invents patterns, especially in poor light, especially after long shifts, especially in a place as disorienting as the polar ocean. He can talk himself out of a silhouette, but he cannot talk himself out of intention. He cannot explain away the impression that the thing in the water made a choice, and the witnesses always say the same thing. It was not the size that undid them. It was not the color. It was the movement, the sense that the thing in the water had decided something. Then the man at the rail calls out. He grabs the nearest crewman, points, says, "Look at that. What is that?" A second man comes to the rail, sometimes a third, and they stand together in the brutal cold, shoulders touching, breath fogging in front of them, watching the same pale shape glide past the hull. That element is what gives these accounts their weight. One witness can be tired. One witness can be mistaken. One witness can be primed by a story he half remembered and half forgot. But multiple men, awake, sober, professional, all looking at the same patch of water at the same time and all seeing the same thing, that is considerably harder to explain away. They describe it to each other in the moment. They argue about it afterward. And what they describe, consistently across different ships in different years, is a shape that was wrong. Not wrong the way an unfamiliar fish is wrong. Wrong in a direction that pointed at something none of them wanted to say out loud. These were men who knew whales. That has to be understood before anything else makes sense. A whale is not a mystery to a survey crew at the bottom of the world. It is practically a colleague. They had watched humpbacks roll and breach hundreds of times. They knew the slow gray hump of a minke breaking the surface to breathe. They knew the broad, flat back of a right whale lying heavy in the swell like a capsized boat. Every one of those animals has a logic to it, a shape you can name, a movement you can predict. A whale rises, it blows, it dives, and the body follows the head in a familiar arc. There is nothing about a whale that puzzles a man who has given 10 years of his life to the Southern Ocean. This puzzled them. It was longer than it had any right to be. Some accounts put it at 20 meters, some pushed past 30, longer than the vessel itself in the worst tellings. It was pale, almost white, in a sea where every large animal is dark. And it did not move like an air-breathing animal that dives to feed and returns to the surface. It moved like something built entirely for the water. It turned, the witnesses say, the way a swimmer turns. Not the roll of a whale, not the flick of a fishtail. A turn that had a torso in it. A turn that pivoted around a center, the way a human body pivots in a pool when it reaches the wall and pushes off to continue. And then there is the arrangement of the thing. This is where the accounts stop being merely strange and become something that sits under the skin and stays there. What these men described, again and again, across different ships and different years, was not a shapeless blob of pale flesh. It had parts. The parts were placed where you would not want them to be. At the top, a bulk, a rounded mass that sat the way a head and a pair of shoulders sit. Broad at the top, narrowing slightly below, with the unmistakable silhouette of something upright when seen from a distance in poor light. Below the mass, long pale appendages extending down and out into the dark water. Arms, if you were willing to use that word. And some of the witnesses were. The ones who got the longest look, the ones whose voices dropped when they finally talked about it, some of them described those appendages ending in something much worse. A hand. 5 pale shapes spread in the water. And in the accounts that almost no one wants to repeat, that hand was not still. It opened. It closed. Slowly, deliberately, as though the thing were flexing a stiff hand in the cold the way you flex your fingers after holding something frozen for too long. Sit with that specific detail. A shape can be ice. A pale blur can be a trick of light on water. But a hand that opens and closes is not a thing the brain files under coincidence. It is a thing the brain files under fear. The accounts split when they reach below the torso. Not all versions agree on what was there. Some witnesses were certain they saw 2 legs, long, pale, trailing down into the black water, kicking slowly the way a swimmer kicks when barely moving, just maintaining position. A full human outline then stretched to an impossible size. But other crews, on other nights, describe something different entirely below the shoulders. Not legs at all. A single smooth taper. The body narrowing from those wide shoulders down to a point, ending in a fin. The whole lower half fused into one continuous tail. And then there are the accounts that almost nobody repeats. The witnesses who got the closest. The ones whose angle was just right. The ones who say they saw the front of the thing. And they describe a face with eyes set forward. Not on the sides of the head the way a fish carries its eyes. Forward. Both eyes facing the same direction. The way a predator's eyes face. The way a human's eyes face. And in the worst of those tellings, the eyes did not stare blankly at the sea. They turned. They found the men at the rail. And for one long frozen moment, the thing in the water looked back at the people who were looking at it. Now, step back from the rail, because to understand what the Ningen actually is and where it came from, you have to follow the trail. And the trail is murkier than the believers like to admit. Because for all the descriptions of seasoned professionals and long deployments, the word Ningen did not arrive in the world through a logbook or a naval report or a scientific paper. It arrived through a screen. The stories began spreading in the mid-2000s on Japanese internet forums. Anonymous posts passed from user to user in the small hours of the night. The classic shape of the accounts was always the same. Someone knew someone. A relative who had worked on a ship in the far south. A friend of a friend who came back changed. A man who had seen something he refused to describe in detail, who went quiet whenever anyone brought it up, who carried it around like a weight he could not set down. And with each retelling, the details sharpened. A new image here. A more specific feature there. The hand that opened and closed, the eyes that turned, the length that crept upward from 20 meters to 30 as the story traveled. This is the way legends breathe. This is the way they grow in the dark. And the Ningen grew faster than most. In 2007, Japan's MU magazine, a publication dedicated to paranormal topics, ran a feature that mentioned the creature and claimed the existence of related footage. That same year, people began running searches through satellite mapping software, claiming to spot a pale humanoid shape drifting in Antarctic waters from above. The images were blurry. The shapes were vague. They were almost certainly ice formations, or, as some researchers suggested at the time, misidentified dolphins. But the story had already spread far enough that the blurry image did not matter. The name had already done its work. A 2020 academic paper in the Shima Journal examined the cultural spread of the Ningen legend and suggested the creature may carry genuine folkloric weight in Japan. The authors noted that the 21st century fascination with a giant humanoid shape in Antarctic waters, so far from Japan, but in seas where Japanese whaling operations had run for decades, might reflect complicated and unresolved feelings within Japanese society about whaling itself. The monster in those waters, in other words, might be a projection of guilt rather than a sighting of a real animal. But here is the part that believers keep returning to, and they are not wrong to return to it. The consistency. Scattered witnesses on different vessels in different years, separated by oceans and by the simple fact that they never met, keep producing the same description, the same impossible pale color, the same vast length, the same arrangement, a bulk on top like a head and shoulders, long pale appendages below, the unmistakable outline of a body built the way ours is built. The believer asks the question that should genuinely make you pause for a moment. If this is nothing but imagination, nothing but tired eyes and frightened minds running loose in the dark, then why does the imagination keep building the exact same thing? Why does it never wander? Why is it always the human shape? Never tentacles, never a serpent, never any of the 1,000 other shapes that darkness could suggest. And the geography. The believers stand on ground here that is harder to dismiss than the skeptics would like. The deep is real. The unexplored sections of the Southern Ocean are real. In late 2025, a single research expedition confirmed 30 brand new species in those waters in 1 month of looking, including creatures no textbook had ever described. Scientists who ran that expedition said directly that the region remains profoundly undersampled. If the ocean is still producing entirely unknown carnivorous sponges and new black corals and novel crustaceans in 2025, then the argument that nothing large and unknown could exist down there falls apart pretty quickly. And science has been wrong about large ocean creatures before. The giant squid was a sailor's tall tale for centuries, until a body finally washed up on shore and had to be acknowledged. Species of deep-sea sharks that actually glow in the dark were confirmed only in recent years. Entirely new whales have been formally identified within living memory. So to say the Southern Ocean could conceal something enormous is not the raving of an irrational person. It is nearly common sense. But here is exactly where the case turns. Could conceal is not the same as does conceal, and the distance between those two phrases is precisely where the Ningen falls apart. The deep ocean can hide almost anything. It can hide a 60-foot animal in lightless water no human eye will ever reach. What it cannot do is hide a 30-meter humanoid swimming at the surface in broad view beside a ship in the gray light before dawn. The moment something that size rises to the surface beside a vessel, it is by definition no longer hidden. And a creature of that scale, breathing, surfacing, traveling those waters for as long as the legend claims, would not be a rumor whispered in anonymous internet posts. It would be documented on every research vessel in the southern hemisphere. It would be in every net. It would have washed up on southern beaches many times over. It would have been photographed 10,000 times from ships and drones and satellites. The very thing that makes the deep a perfect hiding place is the exact thing the Ningen sightings throw away. You cannot be invisible in the abyss and casually visible at a ship's rail at the same time. So the most likely explanation is the quiet one. Ice carved by constant wind and wave into shapes that carry the rough outline of shoulders and a head, drifting in light so dim that everything takes on the same pale, colorless quality. And a human brain, wired over millions of years to find faces in shadow, to find bodies in visual noise, to never miss the shape of another person in the dark, doing exactly the job it was built to do. The consistency that believers point to may mean nothing more complicated than this: that the story traveled well, that once the first person used the word human, every person who heard the story afterward already had the image in their head before they ever got to the part about what was actually in the water. Pareidolia, the tendency of the brain to find human shapes in random patterns, is one of the most powerful and well-documented quirks of human perception. Put a trained and exhausted man in the polar dark, show him a pale, drifting mass, and the brain will do the rest without asking permission. The photographs remain unauthenticated. The physical evidence remains at zero. The file, by every official scientific measure, stays closed. No specimen exists. No verified footage exists. No bone in a drawer. No tissue sample. No moment where a scientist held something in their hands and confirmed it. The Ningen is not in any textbook. It is not on any species list. If you asked a marine biologist today to confirm its existence, they would tell you correctly that there is nothing to confirm. And yet the legend does not go away. It surfaces every few years from new crews on new ships, from people who swear they had never heard the word before the night they stood at the rail and saw something that made the word rise in their throats without anyone planting it there first. And maybe that is the actual reason it endures long past the point where a rational explanation should have closed the case completely. Because the Ningen was never really about a creature. It was always about the edges, the blank spaces at the bottom of the map, the cold, dark distances where almost no one watches and almost no one goes. And it is about the oldest specific fear we carry as a species. Not that something monstrous lives out there in the dark, but that something out there in the dark has a face we would recognize. Eyes set forward, both pointing the same direction, finding us at the rail, and looking back for one long frozen moment with something that looks impossibly like recognition. So now the case sits with you. You have heard the geography. You have heard the witnesses. You have heard the explanation that fits almost everything. Almost. So tell me honestly, when you weigh all of it, the consistency across crews and languages and decades, the blank spaces on the map that 2025 science confirmed are still blank, the witnesses who knew the sea better than they knew their own streets, what do you actually believe is down there at the bottom of the world? A trick of ice and a tired brain reaching for a face? Or something the textbooks insist cannot exist, moving slow and deliberate just beneath the surface, wearing a shape we were never supposed to find in those waters? And whichever side you land on, answer me this. Which single detail is the one you simply cannot explain away? Is it the movement against the current? The forward-facing eyes that turned and looked back? Or the name itself? The word those crews reached for before anyone could talk them out of it? The word that does not mean monster? The word that means us.